5:51 a.m., Sunday, March 9th, 2026. Western edge of Phoenix, Arizona. 42 federal agents moved through pre-dawn darkness toward a chain-link perimeter on West Lower Buckeye Road. No sirens, no visible lights. The only sound, boots on gravel, and the low idle of armored vehicles, staged 2 blocks east. The temperature sat at 41 degrees. A low wind moved from the west, carrying the metallic smell of crushed vehicles and hydraulic fluid from the salvage yard. Agents in the breach team wore plate carriers under civilian-cut jackets. The 2 agents designated for trailer entry carried bolt cutters and a ram. Everyone else was positioned to hold the perimeter. At the rear of the property, behind 4,000 square feet of crushed vehicle inventory and a rusted corrugated fence, sat a converted office trailer. Windowless on 3 sides, a single padlocked door, facing inward, away from the street. The trailer's exterior had been painted the same flat gray as the corrugated fence beside it. From the street, from the air, it read as storage infrastructure. It was not. The FBI entry team was through the main gate in 11 seconds. Inside that trailer, 8 American women. 8 names from missing persons reports filed in Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California. The youngest, 24. The oldest, 38. Missing between 41 and 117 days. The property at 4800 block of West Lower Buckeye Road was registered in county records as Sonoran Auto Recyclers, LLC. 8 years of operation. A valid license from the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. 22 employees on the payroll. 3 major Phoenix area garages listed it as a parts supplier. On the street, it looked like every other mid-size salvage operation in the valley. A flat acreage of stacked vehicles, forklift tracks in the dirt, a weigh station near the entrance. The business moved roughly $11 million in recycled parts annually. Tax filings were current, no outstanding violations. The kind of business that generates no federal attention because there is no federal reason to look. That was the point. What actually ran through Sonoran Auto Recyclers had nothing to do with legitimate parts recycling. The yard was a logistics cover and physical operations node for a procurement cell that had been running for 19 months before federal agents ever set foot on the property. The cell's primary function was sanctions evasion. Specifically, sourcing, laundering, and containerizing dual-use electronics for export to Iran-linked end users. The parts moved through the salvage stream, pulled from vehicle carcasses, repackaged as general automotive components, and documented as domestic scrap sales before leaving the country inside mixed manifest shipping containers. For 19 months it worked. 3 questions would shape this investigation from its opening moment to the pre-dawn raid. First, how did a routine parts trace by ATF unravel a dual-use electronics pipeline? Second, who were the women in the trailer, and how did a sanctions evasion cell connect to their disappearances? Third, 2 of the cell's operators were gone before agents arrived. Where did they go, and who told them? Those answers would come, but not quickly. The investigation did not begin with Sonoran Auto Recyclers. It began 230 miles east in a federal storage facility outside Tucson, Arizona, where ATF examiners were cataloging components seized from an unrelated Arizona warehouse case in late October 2025. Among the items recovered from that warehouse, a drone gyroscope unit, compact, civilian-grade but dual-use capable. The part number matched a series of stabilization gyros that had appeared repeatedly in Iranian pattern unmanned aerial systems documented by the Defense Intelligence Agency since 2023. ATF's National Center for Explosives Training and Research ran a provenance trace on the part. The trail moved through 3 intermediary invoices before arriving at a containerized export that had originated at a Phoenix salvage yard. The export manifest listed the contents as mixed automotive scrap and used electronic modules. The exporter of record, Sonoran Auto Recyclers, LLC. ATF flagged the trace to the FBI Phoenix Field Office and to Homeland Security Investigations, which held primary jurisdiction over sanctions violations and export control enforcement. A joint review opened in November 25. Not a full investigation yet. A review. Analysts pulling records, cross-referencing export filings, checking whether the gyro was a one-time anomaly or evidence of a pattern. The pattern was not hard to find. Over 19 months, Sonoran Auto Recyclers had filed 47 export manifests, listing mixed automotive components destined for freight consolidators in the UAE, Turkey, and Malaysia. Of those 47 shipments, the total declared value was just over $3.2 million, consistent with legitimate parts recycling. What the manifests did not declare: the containerized loads consistently contained dual-use electronics segregated from general scrap, drone control boards, voltage modulators compatible with military specification power systems, inertial measurement units, items controlled under the Export Administration regulations, items that required specific licensing to ship abroad, licenses that Sonoran Auto Recyclers had never applied for and never received. 26% of the manifest weight in audited shipments could not be accounted for by the automotive parts listed. The industry baseline for manifest discrepancy in legitimate salvage exports ran between 3 and 5%. 26% could not exist in a legitimate operation. The HSI team running the export control angle already knew they had a front. What they didn't know yet, what no one in the Joint Task Force knew until the surveillance phase began, was what else the property was being used for. One detail from the surveillance logs stuck with our analysts. The camera coverage at Sonoran Auto Recyclers was completely inverted. 4 exterior cameras mounted to face outward, toward the street and the gate, and a single interior camera positioned to cover the rear of the lot, specifically the converted office trailer. Exterior surveillance that monitors incoming threats is standard. Interior surveillance pointed at a single structure on your own property is not a security measure. It is a control measure. The HSI lead analyst flagged it in a case note dated January 14, 2026. The note read, "Single interior camera, rear office structure, manually monitored, not networked to exterior system." That distinction mattered. Surveillance of the property ran for 6 weeks, beginning in late November 2025. Federal agents used aerial observation, vehicle-mounted cameras staged at commercial properties on adjacent streets, and a legally authorized pen register on the primary phone line registered to the business. A warrant for physical surveillance devices required probable cause on the sanctions-evasion prong, which by early December the task force had in sufficient quantity. The aerial platform used during the initial surveillance phase was a fixed-wing aircraft operating under a generic flight plan that kept it in a commercial corridor above the yard. It carried a stabilized electro-optical camera package capable of resolving individual faces at altitude. Agents reviewed the footage in rotating 4-hour shifts, logging every vehicle that entered or exited the property, every individual observed on the lot, and every instance of material being loaded or moved near the rear of the property. The logs from the first 3 weeks of aerial surveillance ran to over 200 pages of annotated imagery. 3 individuals emerged as the operational core. The individual running the day-to-day yard operations was documented arriving daily at approximately 5:45 a.m. and departing after 6 p.m. He drove the same vehicle every day, a silver late-model pickup registered to a business address in Glendale. He used the same gate entry sequence on every visit, pausing to scan a keypad before driving through. A second individual, identified in records as a logistics coordinator, visited the property 3 to 4 times per week and was traced to an address in Tempe. He arrived in the afternoon and typically stayed between 1 and 3 hours. On several occasions, he was observed carrying document folders into the main office structure. The third, a financial operator, appeared on property roughly once per week and was linked to the corporate registration documents and the banking relationships. He drove different vehicles on different visits. 4 distinct registered vehicles appeared across the 6-week surveillance window, all of them connected to the same beneficial owner through layered LLC registrations. A 4th and 5th individual, 2 men who appeared on property less frequently and were not on any employee roster, were traced through vehicle registrations to addresses outside the United States. Both held foreign travel documents. Both had entered the country on business visas. Their identities were matched to names that appeared in a sealed Department of State Security bulletin that had been circulated to friendly liaison services, flagging possible procurement activity linked to an Iran-aligned network operating through commercial front companies in the Gulf region. Those 2 individuals were not arrested on March 9th. They were gone. More on that in a moment. The open question that emerged during the surveillance phase came from a source the task force had not anticipated. A missing persons detective with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office was running a routine cross-check of known commercial properties against a list of vehicles associated with unresolved missing persons cases from the previous year. It was not a targeted inquiry. It was the kind of administrative sweep that generates nothing 99% of the time. This was the 1%. 2 vehicles connected to separate missing persons cases from the prior 6 months had been processed through Sonoran auto recyclers on dates that placed them at the yard weeks after the women associated with those vehicles were reported missing. The vehicles had been listed in NCHIC. The fact that they ended up at a salvage yard was, in isolation, explainable. Vehicles abandoned by missing persons sometimes find their way into the salvage stream through towing and title transfer. But 2 vehicles, same yard. Within a 2-month window, the detective pulled the intake logs. The vehicles had been processed not through the standard intake line, but through a secondary intake logged under a separate internal code the yard used for what its own records described as direct source acquisitions. The intake dates matched a time frame when 2 of the 8 women had already been reported missing. The detective contacted the FBI Phoenix field office on January 22, 2026. The call was routed to the agent coordinating the joint HSI FBI task force on the Sonoran Auto Recyclers sanctions case. Within 72 hours, the investigation had 2 prongs. Before that call reached the task force coordinator, the detective had already spent 3 days building a preliminary link analysis on her own time. She had pulled intake records from the county assessor's database, cross-referenced towing company logs, filed with the Arizona Motor Vehicle Division, and identified a 3rd vehicle, not yet connected to a missing persons report, that had been processed through the same internal code at Sonoran in December 2025. She brought a 12-page summary to that first call with the FBI. The task force coordinator later described it in a debrief as the most organized cold contact briefing he had received in 16 years of federal work. The 12 pages prompted a subpoena for the yard's complete internal acquisition records, going back to the operating period start date. Those records arrived at the FBI field office on January 28th. They contained reference to 8 vehicle intake entries, coded under the direct source acquisition category. 8 vehicles, 8 missing persons cases. Once the expanded NSIC cross-check was run 2 days later, 8 women. At that point, the task force had a working hypothesis that the women were still on the property. The interior camera covering the trailer, the unusual construction of the rear structure, the fact that none of the 8 women had generated any financial or communications activity following their disappearances, no ATM withdrawals, no cell pings, no social media. 8 people who had effectively ceased to exist in the data environment. The hypothesis became a working assumption on February 3, 2026, when a licensed contractor, obtained by the task force under a pretext inspection order, assessed the trailer's utility connection at the property boundary. The yard drew power and water from a single commercial utility feed. The contractor's assessment reported back to the task force through an FBI technical liaison, indicated that the utility draw at the rear of the property was inconsistent with an unoccupied storage structure. The water usage in particular was elevated above any reasonable baseline for a building used only for storage or equipment. People were drawing water from that trailer. The assumption became a near certainty. What's striking about how this case developed, the sanctions evasion operation and the use of the trailer had been running in parallel the entire time. But neither federal team investigating the yard had looked at what was happening at the physical structure on the property's rear boundary. The export control prong had been built entirely on paper and electronic surveillance. No one had stood outside that trailer. No one had run a heat signature. The two operations had been sharing real estate for 19 months, and the connection only emerged because a county detective was doing a data sweep that had nothing to do with Iran or export controls. This case reveals something about compartmentalized federal investigations. Each team worked its own lane precisely, developed strong evidence, and would likely have made arrests on the sanctions case without ever opening that trailer door. The women inside would not have been recovered in that scenario. They would have been moved, or simply not found. The structure of the investigation had to change immediately. The open sanctions probe, which had been operating with the expectation of several more weeks of evidence gathering before any arrest action, now had a human captivity dimension that forced them to move faster. You cannot run a 6-week countdown to arrest when there are people in a locked structure on the target property. You move the date forward, and you move it forward carefully, because moving it forward recklessly gets people hurt. Here's the part that doesn't make immediate sense. The task force's original arrest plan had called for a weekday morning approach, timed to catch the maximum number of operators on site during business hours. The revised plan required the opposite, a Sunday pre-dawn approach, specifically chosen to land before any shift personnel arrived, to minimize the number of individuals on the property who could respond to the breach in an uncontrolled way. The trade-off was real. A weekday approach maximized arrest coverage. The Sunday approach prioritized the trailer. You couldn't do both. The decision was made at the assistant special agent in charge level, coordinated between FBI and HSI, and documented in a tactical operations plan, submitted for review on February 26, 2026. The plan designated March 9th as the target date. Primary breach team, FBI tactical unit. Secondary team, HSI agents for simultaneous arrest of the logistics coordinator at his Tempe residence. A third element would execute a financial warrant at the banking addresses connected to the financial operator. The tactical operations plan ran 41 pages. It included a dedicated medical annex covering triage protocols for people who had been held captive. The annex listed Banner University Medical Center as the designated receiving facility, and specified that at least 2 federal victim services personnel would be embedded with the primary breach team to move to the trailer immediately following the all-clear from the tactical lead. The medical annex had been developed in consultation with the FBI's Victim Services Division and a physician on contract with HSI who had experience helping trafficking survivors. There was also a contingency annex covering the possibility that the trailer was empty on the morning of March 9th, that the women had been moved in the days between the final surveillance confirmation and the raid date. That contingency was assigned a probability estimate. It was not 0. The task force carried it into the operation knowing it might open an empty structure. The alternative, delaying in hopes of better intelligence on the trailer's occupancy status, was assessed as carrying greater risk than executing on current information. The plan carried one significant obstacle that the task force had not fully resolved before the final brief. The 2 foreign national operators, the ones flagged in the State Department liaison bulletin, had not been located in the days leading up to the raid. Surveillance indicated they had been present on the property as recently as mid-February 2026. By early March, neither vehicle associated with those individuals had been observed at the property, or at any of the residential addresses connected to them. On March 7th, 2 days before the raid, HSI ran a check through Customs and Border Protection's departure records. Both individuals had left the country through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport on March 5th, 48 hours before the planned operation. Different flights, different destinations. Someone had warned them. The task force did not know that on March 7th, they had a working hypothesis. But an investigation into how the departure information was obtained was not something that could be resolved before the March 9th timeline. The human captivity dimension did not allow for a delay. The raid would proceed with the understanding that 2 of the 5 primary targets were already outside U.S. jurisdiction. Put yourself in the lead agent's position on the night of March 8th. You have a solid sanctions case. You have a human captivity situation that has been running for months. You have 3 targets you can arrest in the morning, and you have 2 targets who just walked out of the country 2 days before your operation. You don't know if the tip came from inside the task force, from a communications intercept by the cell, or from a source you haven't identified yet. You execute the operation as planned, because the alternative is worse. But you know the morning is going to produce questions you don't yet have answers to. The raid went into final staging at approximately 5 a.m. on March 9, 2026. 4 separate elements deployed simultaneously. The primary FBI tactical team moved on the West Lower Buckeye Road property. A secondary HSI arrest element moved on the Tempe residential address of the logistics coordinator. A 3rd element executed the financial warrant. A 4th element, unmarked vehicles, plainclothes agents, established observation positions on roads leading out of the area to catch any personnel who fled the property before the breach. At 5:51 a.m., the primary team was through the gate. The 3 operators present at the facility were detained in the first 4 minutes. 1 was found in the main office structure near the front of the lot. 1 was located near the vehicle intake area. The 3rd was in a parked vehicle on the property's south end. The FBI tactical team reached the office trailer at 5:55 a.m. The padlock on the exterior door was cut. The door was opened at 5:56 a.m. The trailer had been modified internally. A central corridor with 2 lateral rooms on each side and a larger room at the far end. The rooms were not equipped as standard office spaces. They had been adapted for long-term occupancy. Cots, basic sanitation access through a single internal connection to the yard's utility line, a manually controlled ventilation unit. The corridor measured approximately 6 feet wide. The 4 lateral rooms were roughly 8 by 10 feet each. The larger room at the far end was approximately 12 by 14. Interior walls had been added using lightweight partition framing that was not part of the trailer's original construction. The modifications were functional and deliberate. There was a working light fixture in each room, standard LED strip lighting on a single circuit. There was a centrally located water access point in the corridor. The sanitation connection ran to a holding tank below the trailer's floor, not connected to the municipal sewer line. That holding tank had to be pumped periodically. Surveillance logs later identified 3 instances over the 6-week observation period, when a commercial pumping vehicle, registered to a sanitation company with no other business relationship to the yard, had visited the property and accessed the rear area. No one on the surveillance team had flagged those visits as anomalous at the time. The pumping visits were logged as unidentified service calls. It was only after the raid that the log entries were cross-referenced against the trailer's sanitation infrastructure, and the connection became clear. All 8 women were present. All were ambulatory. All were responsive to agents' verbal identification. Federal agents provided immediate on-site medical assessment. Banner University Medical Center had been notified in advance and was prepared to receive multiple individuals under federal escort. The first moments after the door opened appear in the debrief materials. The lead entry agent identified herself verbally as FBI, stated that the women were safe, and stepped back from the doorway to allow the victim services personnel to move forward. The two victim services coordinators were through the door within seconds of the tactical clearance. The deliberate choice to step back, to have a uniformed tactical agent immediately yield ground to civilian-dressed support personnel, had been built into the trailer entry protocol. The task force had consulted with a trauma specialist during the planning phase, who emphasized that the visual presentation of the first figures through the door would determine how the women reacted. Weapons visible, uniformed figures. Both of those factors could trigger responses that complicated the recovery process. The protocol was designed around that input. The women were transported in 2 vehicles beginning at 6:17 a.m. All 8 arrived at Banner University Medical Center before 7 a.m. They were evaluated for medical conditions consistent with prolonged confinement. The hospital's initial intake documentation, as later summarized in the federal case materials, noted in clinical language that each woman's medical status reflected how long she'd been missing, ranging from 41 days to 117 days. Before the women were transported, each was asked, by the victim services coordinators, not by investigating agents, whether she wanted to contact a family member immediately. 5 of the 8 said yes. The coordinators facilitated those calls on site, before transport, using federal-issued phones. 3 of the 8 did not make calls in that immediate window. The reasons were not recorded in the case file. While the transport was underway, the evidence processing team moved onto the property. The search warrant covered the entire parcel, the main office structure, the vehicle intake area, outbuildings, the trailer itself, and any vehicles present on the lot. The primary evidence team was 12 agents and 2 forensic specialists. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. From the main office structure, they recovered the debt tracking ledger, the locked cabinet containing personal document packets for each of the 8 women, 2 laptops, 1 desktop workstation, and an external hard drive. They recovered a physical logbook covering vehicle intake entries going back 14 months. They recovered a mobile phone left in the office by one of the detained operators, a phone that was not the registered number associated with him in any available database. That phone became a significant evidence item. Its contents, as processed by the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit, included encrypted messaging application data that the Digital Forensics team was able to partially recover after the device's storage was imaged. The partial recovery produced contact records and message fragments that advanced the investigation's understanding of the cell's external communications chain. From the vehicle intake area, they recovered physical records matching the internal acquisition code identified in the original NOC cross-check, hard copy intake sheets for vehicles associated with each of the 8 missing persons cases. From the trailer itself, forensic specialists documented the interior modifications, collected biological evidence from the rooms, and photographed the utility connections. The forensic documentation of the trailer interior took 4 hours. A debt tracking ledger recovered from the main office building listed all 8 names alongside numerical balances and daily entries. The ledger had been maintained continuously, the oldest entry dated to the previous October. The ledger was recovered intact. Document packets associated with each woman were found in a locked cabinet in the same office structure. Personal identification documents, driver's licenses. In several cases, additional documents that agents determined had been used to give the cell leverage over each individual's freedom of movement. The cell had enforced compliance through document seizure and a structured debt system that made each woman's release contingent on satisfying a fabricated financial obligation that increased over time. The case file runs over 600 pages. There's a section in the indictment's factual basis that reads almost like a financial audit. Columns of names, dates, amounts credited for labor performed, amounts debited for housing and food supplied by the operators. The math was designed to never reach zero. The debt grew faster than any amount of labor could reduce it. The 8 women came from different circumstances. Their names have not been publicly released. What the case file does establish, through the missing persons reports, through the initial statements collected by victim services coordinators, and through the biographical information contained in each woman's document packet, shows how the cell sourced its victims and why the missing persons infrastructure failed to connect them sooner. 3 of the 8 had been reported missing by family members within the first week of their disappearance. Those reports generated standard follow-up, welfare checks at last known addresses, phone records requested, social media reviewed. When those checks produced no immediate leads, the cases moved into the standard backlog that characterizes missing adult investigations at the county level, active in name, under-resourced in practice. The cases were not closed, but they were not generating daily investigative activity after the first 2 weeks. 2 of the 8 had been reported missing by employers when they failed to appear for shifts and did not respond to contact attempts. Those reports were filed with Phoenix PD and with one department in the Las Vegas metro area. Employer-filed missing persons reports for adults are treated as lower priority initial contacts because adult employees who stop showing up to work and stop responding to contact are more commonly exercising their legal right to leave an employment situation than they are missing in the criminal sense. The reports received initial response. They did not receive sustained investigative follow-up. 2 of the 8 had reports filed by friends, people who were not immediate family and did not have legal standing as next of kin. Friend-filed reports for missing adults face additional friction in the intake process. The case file for one of these 2 women reflects 3 separate attempts to file a report before the report was formally accepted and assigned a case number. One of the 8 had no missing persons report filed on her behalf at all prior to January 28, 2026. The date the FBI's expanded NCCHIC cross-check identified all 8 vehicle intake entries at Sonoran Auto Recyclers. Her vehicle was in the secondary intake log. Her name appeared in the debt ledger. She had been in that trailer for 94 days before any law enforcement database reflected that she was gone. Here's what the case warrants saying directly. The federal apparatus that eventually freed these women did so because an ATF examiner traced a drone gyro and a county detective ran a data sweep. Neither action was targeted at what was happening inside that trailer. The women were recovered as a consequence of investigative work aimed at something else entirely. That is not a failure of individual agents. The work done once the connection was established was swift and competent, but the systems designed to find missing adults in situations like this one did not find them. Parallel systems aimed at export control violations did. What this reveals about the gap between missing persons infrastructure and the actual patterns of how people go missing is a question this case raises clearly and leaves unanswered. In the weeks following the raid, FBI agents conducted formal interviews with each of the 8 women as part of the ongoing investigation. Those interviews were conducted at locations of the women's choosing, with victim services coordinators present, and recording required explicit consent. The interview summaries that appear in the case file are agent-written, not transcribed. They describe, in general terms, the circumstances of each woman's initial contact with individuals connected to the cell, the means by which each woman was transported to the property, and the conditions of confinement as experienced over the period of their detention. Several of the women described being recruited through what appeared to be legitimate job listings. The specifics varied: different platforms, different stated job descriptions, different contact methods. What the summaries reflect in common is a contact and recruitment pattern designed to look like ordinary job recruitment until the woman was on the property. After that point, documents were taken. A debt figure was introduced. The mechanism of control was in place before the woman had a framework for understanding what had happened. 2 of the women described being told during the initial period of their detention that law enforcement contact was not an option because their situation involved debt to individuals who had relationships with law enforcement. That claim was false, but it was designed to be credible enough to suppress the impulse toward seeking help from outside. The task force noted in its case summary that the claim, whether believed or not, added weeks to the effective isolation of the individuals who heard it, during which they were less likely to attempt contact with anyone outside the property. One of the 8 women had attempted to leave a physical message for outside discovery on 2 separate occasions. Both attempts were identified by the operators and documented in the internal ledger as violations that resulted in debt increases. The ledger entry language for these incidents was clinical. Item: unauthorized communication attempt. Amount added. Running total updated. It read like an expense report. The 3 arrested individuals were transferred to federal custody at the William D. Browning Federal Building in Phoenix on the afternoon of March 9th. Each was processed separately. Each was assigned federal public defenders. Each invoked counsel before any substantive questioning by agents. The post-arrest investigative interviews, conducted with counsel present and under standard federal proffer protocols for those defendants who chose to engage, produced varying levels of cooperation. One of the 3 provided information about the communications chain connecting the cell to its external procurement network. That information was useful to the ongoing sanctions investigation, but did not advance the search for the 2 foreign nationals who had departed on March 5th. The other 2 defendants declined to provide any substantive information in the proffer context. The Financial Operators Council filed a motion for bail release within 48 hours of arraignment. The motion argued that the defendant had significant community ties, no prior criminal record, and had surrendered voluntarily to agents rather than fleeing. The government opposed the motion on the grounds that the defendants demonstrated use of multiple vehicle registrations and layered business structures constituted a flight risk, and that the sanctions charges, which carried potential sentences that created strong incentive for flight, outweighed the community ties argument. The bail motion was denied. All 3 defendants remained in custody pending trial. In the simultaneous operation at the Tempe residential address, the logistics coordinator was arrested without incident at 6:04 a.m. The financial operator was detained by the 3rd element at a separate location at 6:12 a.m. In total, 3 individuals were arrested on the morning of March 9th. All 3 were charged under Title 18 of the United States Code, with conspiracy to violate the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, conspiracy to commit export control violations, and additional charges related to forced labor and document seizure, as defined under federal human trafficking statutes. The financial operator faced additional charges connected to the structure of the banking relationships used to move proceeds from the parts sales. HSI's Financial Intelligence Unit had traced those funds through 4 domestic accounts and 2 foreign money service businesses operating under licensing in the UAE. The 2 foreign nationals who departed the country on March 5th remain at large as of the date of this account. A sealed indictment covers both. The State Department liaison bulletin previously issued has been updated. Extradition prospects depend on the jurisdictions where those individuals are currently located, neither of which has been publicly disclosed. The 47 export shipments from Sonoran Auto Recyclers are under continued review by the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security. Not all of the dual-use components shipped over the 19-month operating period have been traced to their ultimate end users. The containers passed through multiple freight consolidators before reaching destinations outside U.S. jurisdiction. Some of those components are presumed to have reached their intended end users. The volume of material that moved through the pipeline before the operation was identified runs to hundreds of individual units across multiple controlled categories. The gyroscope trace that started the investigation, the single part number that an ATF examiner flagged in a Tucson evidence room in October 2025, was eventually traced back through the manifests to a shipment that had left Phoenix in April 2025. By that time, the yard had been operating as a dual-use front for 9 months. 38 export containers had already cleared U.S. ports. The operation ran for 19 months because it was designed to be invisible. The legitimate business was real. The employees were real. The DEQ license was real. The garages buying parts from the yard were buying legitimate parts. The cover was not a paper fiction. It was a functioning business that also routed controlled electronics to sanctioned end users and housed 8 women in a locked trailer at the back of the lot. There's a line in the affidavit supporting the arrest warrants that captures the architecture of the operation in one sentence. It reads, "The commercial activity was not a pretext for the illicit activity. Both were conducted simultaneously and deliberately, each providing cover for the other." Will operations structured this way, fully functional commercial fronts running dual-use procurement in parallel, continue to emerge in the next 5 years? Comment yes or no, because the enforcement gap that this case exposed was not a surveillance failure. The surveillance, once pointed at the right location, developed evidence quickly. The gap was recognition time. 19 months elapsed between the start of operations and the first federal flag. In that window, dozens of shipments left the country, and 8 women went missing. The 3 arrested operators were held without bail, pending arraignment in the United States District Court for the District of Arizona. Arraignment was scheduled for the week following the arrest. As of the date of this account, the cases have not gone to trial. The women recovered from the trailer were connected with Federal Victim Services coordinators at Banner University Medical Center. Their identities have not been publicly released. The federal prosecutor's office confirmed in a statement that all 8 are cooperating with the ongoing investigation. 7 of the 8 have been reunited with family members. The 8th has not been publicly identified as having family located. The cell is dismantled. The export pipeline it operated is disrupted. The 2 men who built it and who walked out of a Dallas-Fort Worth terminal gate on March 5th are somewhere outside U.S. jurisdiction. The gyroscope parts already shipped are already gone, and the 19 months that elapsed before the first flag remain 19